Okay, we're going to look at the instructions for the assignment, and then we're going to look at what you've got so far and see what you have to do to improve the outline that you've got so that you can do a final project that makes sense. First of all, you see all these instructions, and it asks you to designate a format for your presentation. I didn't really see a very clear format that you have in mind. Have you decided on a format? My guess is that since you want to do something that relates to racial segregation, you'd better either do an essay or a slide presentation. Now, the problem with a slide presentation is that you don't want to just say a few words on a few slides. That's not going to substitute for an essay of 1,000 or more words. And you can't put 1,000 words in a slideshow because that means you're going to be filling up every slide with text. So that doesn't make a lot of sense either. So in order to be most safe, you probably should go with an essay. Forget the other forms of presentation because you still haven't got a clear sense of where you want to head. So at this late date, since you haven't gotten through that section of the project, that outline, the necessary outline, I don't think you want to load yourself up with difficulty in terms of the modality of your presentation. So what you need to do is to settle on an essay. Why don't you just decide, I'm going to write an essay? There's too much that you have to do at this point to get your outline up to shape to worry about these very creative alternatives. That would have been nice, but let's just go with the essay. Now, in terms of the theme, none of these themes were designated in your most recent outline. I'm not sure why you didn't pick one of these themes, but you were supposed to. And it could be democracy and diversity or politics and citizenship, but I would say democracy and diversity should be your theme if you're going to talk about racial segregation and how destructive it was. Obviously, it was destructive to the sense of equal rights for all and democracy. And you haven't done that yet. Then it says choose a medium and narrow your topic. Well, you still haven't done that, although you have narrowed it to segregation. And you've made clear that you want to talk about segregation in, I guess, the 40s, 50s, and 60s. But you really want to designate a particular time frame. And so let's keep it down to at most 25 years, better yet, 15 years. So you could do 1954 to 1968. I know that's not 15 years, but it's 14 years, and that's pretty close. Because 1954, of course, was the Brown versus Board of Education decision, and 1968 was the Kerner Commission, which was a presidential commission that revealed that Americans were still grappling with civil rights and race relations and had certainly not overcome the difficulties in that subject because race riots were breaking out all over America in 1968, which of course was the year that Dr. King was assassinated. So I like the idea that you're limiting yourself to segregation because you don't want to talk about every aspect of race relations. So that's good. And if you limit yourself from 1954 to 1968, you can talk about Brown versus Board of Education at the beginning, and you can talk about the extent to which racial segregation was eliminated from American life during that period of time. Because after all, in Brown versus Board of Education decision in 1954 said that segregation is illegal and must stop as soon as possible. And yet, in 1968, race relations were still in a state of disarray. But segregation itself may have improved over time. What were the forces that delayed progress in terms of desegregation, and what were the forces that were helping to speed it along? And what was the state of desegregation by 1968? Maybe you should just deal with those questions and talk about historical development over time, and you will be in a good position. But let's take a look at your existing outline and see why that is deficient. And here it is. Again, you don't use one of the themes that you were supposed to use. You weren't supposed to invent a theme. You were supposed to choose one of the themes in the instructions. The topic, the racial segregation, well, what about it? What is your thesis going to be about? It's going to be about how much progress occurred in racial desegregation from 1954 to, say, to 1968. And the thesis has to be in the form of an argument. Now, this is an argument, but it's very vague. And, of course, atrocious is a totally meaningless word. It means bad, of course, but, bad is something that can't be really measured. An example of a thesis would be, between 1954 and 1968, racial desegregation achieved what? Then you have to fill in that gap of what? Achieved very little, achieved rapid success, then failure, was long delayed, but in the last few years showed signs of progress. I don't know. That's for you to judge. But you have to make an argument about how much progress was made, state how much it was made in the thesis, and then demonstrate that with examples in the paper. So here you have some questions. So you would eliminate this question. That's not relevant because racial segregation began long before 1954. This is also irrelevant because that's also before 1954. This too is irrelevant because you're starting when segregation ended legally, although segregation continued in practice. This question is so vague as to be meaningless. How did the segregation affect education? I guess you mean, how did it hurt black students? Which is a very good question, but I couldn't tell whether you meant that or not. And that's outside the scope of the question if you agree with the thesis I've proposed for you. And so these questions are not really relevant to the structure that I have proposed. Instead, you need to look at that period and break it down into times of progress and times of lack of progress in terms of desegregating the schools, and where were we at the end of the period, and why was so little done, if you think so, and why was so much done, if you think that. So I hope this helps you with the assignment.